Hello everyone and welcome to Of God in Mind. Uh, Tonight we're going to be trying something a little different that we haven't done before. We are going to be looking at this old philosophical text that you see on your screen, which is Cratylus by Plato, which I'll describe a bit in a minute, and we'll be sort of working through a segment of it and discussing it as we go, and we'll see how that goes for something to discuss. Hopefully there'll be something worthwhile in it for everyone. So, uh, well, first, with me here tonight, we have Reggie,
Hello.
Adam,
Evening, folks.
and Jacob.
G'day.
Right, so this book we're looking at. So this is Cratylus, a book written by Plato in the 4th century BC, roughly. Um, but if you've heard of ancient Greek philosophers, you've probably heard of Plato. And it's potentially... See, Plato's interesting as well as Socrates, because Plato was Socrates' student. I really got to stop highlighting everything, that's a bad habit. I just fiddle with the mouse. But yeah, Plato is Socrates' student, and Socrates himself did not write anything, but pretty much every one of Plato's books uses Socrates as the main character. So whether that's because Plato's books are recounting things Socrates said and did, like this is a conversation and discussion that actually happened, or whether it's just Socrates was well known, so he made a nice mouthpiece for Plato.
So I've been told something, and I don't know if it's true. I don't remember where I read this or was told this, but apparently Socrates wasn't a fan of writing, like written language, because it weakened the mind, because you wouldn't have to remember things anymore. So that's why Plato wrote down Socrates' lessons and these dialogues.
I wouldn't be surprised if that's true.
Yeah.
I don't know myself. I don't know too much about it. I know he did have some kind of wacky ideas as well as his good ones.
Yeah.
That's kind of why he got, well, forceful suicide.
Whoa.
Yeah.
But that was
Forceful
also...
suicide.
That's kind of called murder?
No, the Athenian council was just demanded that he commit suicide as like execution. It was relatively
Usually considered
common,
murder.
like Roman commanders being called to fall on their sword or Japanese seppuku.
Yeah.
It's sort of, you can die, either we can execute you or you can kill yourself and retain your honor as sort of a
Yeah, honor
recognition
thing.
that you've done wrong. And he chose, well, he went through with being with poisoning himself with hemlock, I believe.
Huh.
I mean, I question whether you retain your honor by following the state's wishes that you kill yourself, but that's not what we're here to discuss, I don't think.
Anyway.
Yeah. Honor's a funny thing. And I understand it, but anyway, what?
Pretty bad VKD ratio.
Yeah, so basically, like my take is that this probably is stuff that Socrates taught on and was discussed. I don't think Plato... ancient writers aren't as fast and loose with convention and using characters as mouthpieces and everything as often people say they are. Like, they didn't exactly have tape recorders to go back and record everything a person said. And a lot of the time they just sort of recreated speeches from some of the keynotes that was hit, but they don't exactly write as other people all the time. So I tend to think that, yeah, at least, especially during the early period, maybe he started just using Socrates as a character later on in Plato's life because he wrote a lot of things. And might have just run out of things Socrates did. But this is a pretty early book, I think, and for at least the early ones, I reckon it was just recalling some of the parts of Socrates' life and teaching. And the theme of this book, well, it's got a lot to do with language. That's sort of why we're starting with this kind of random book. because I did a big linguistics assignment on it, analyzing some of the later claims it makes about language and word construction and whether they're actually created in that way. I might make a video on that at some point too, sort of some interesting things there. Though I didn't find anything too interesting with his claims. Basically, they were pretty much all wrong. Some things he was pretty clever with, and he worked some things out way before linguistics started in the 18th century. But a lot of his ideas were just way too abstract. But anyway, we are here to discuss this first part, which is a sort of philosophical argument that there is a rightness to names, that the name of something is sort of fitting to it. Ultimately, that's what the whole book's about. It's like even the linguistic sort of parts of it. It's these the sounds and the letters that make up a word are there because they sort of mimic and describe that word. They're not just arbitrary. And we start here at the very start with these sort of general things, and we'll just get into it really. So I'll start reading here. This is where we started from. And it's a dialogue sort of thing, sort of like a play script is basically what we're reading. You have three characters. You've got Socrates himself, you've got Hermogenes and Cratylus, Cratylus doesn't show up in this part at all, I don't think. But basically it's a conversation between these three guys. Hermogenes and Cratylus were having an argument. Socrates walked past and they're like, hey, Hermogenes is like, hey Socrates, you want to join our argument? We're talking about language. And Socrates was like, sure. So that's our setting.
So are all of these real, like, historical people?
Well, Socrates was. Hermogenes and Cratylus, we don't know anything beyond this actual, like, document. So
Okay.
Who knows?
Because I mean, when I looked through this earlier, it almost looked like Hermogenes, I think, was like an audience insert character just to enable Socrates to espouse dialogue.
Yeah, that's kind of what he does a lot. Hermogenes is sort of the young student who sort of prods Socrates along and asks some questions and that. He does have a couple of, like, throughout the book he does have a couple of bits where he goes like, I'm not sure about that, Socrates. Here's my opinion. Or he gets real interested in some things. So it could be like an actual person, or he could just be an audience device. But yeah, the only person we know is real, or that I know is real at least, is Socrates. And presumably some of the other, he does mention other linguists and philosophers at times. I just found Protagoras, who I know is a real dude. But anyway, I will stop with the idle scrolling again. I've pretty much got to take my hand off the mouse to do this. So, I'll just start reading then. This is Hermogenes speaking. I have often talked over this matter, both with Cratylus and others, and cannot convince myself that there is any principle of correctness in names other than convention and agreement. Any name which you give, in my opinion, is the right one, and if you change that and give another, the new name is as correct as the old. We frequently change the names of our slaves, and the newly imposed name is as good as the old, for there is no name given to anything by nature. All is convention and habit of the users. Such is my view. But if I am mistaken, I shall be happy to hear and learn of Cratylus, or of anyone else. Let's actually talk through that first, because because the rest is Socrates sort of tearing down that argument. So let's discuss what we think of that first. That the name of something is simply convention, agreement.
I mean, I guess one way to look at it is the fact that, I mean, I guess I don't know enough about other languages to really say for sure, but I mean, different languages have different words for things that aren't the same word.
That was my first thought. Like, which language is the correct language if there's a correct word for particular things?
Well, Greek, of course. Everyone else are barbarians. But yeah, I tend to agree. And this is, like, that sort of claim is what I was analyzing in my essay, and there's very little. He did have some points that needed more investigation, I have found. But for the most part, it was, yeah, that it follows with sort of modern linguistics and that names are just sort of, they're what's agreed upon by a community of people, a community of speakers. And
Yeah.
I mean, they can change. So, like, academic words, for example, are some of your good examples of this because it's a very small community of speakers and they want a very precise word to describe what you're talking about. So you can often have sort of academic specialist terms change quite frequently because someone finds a better fitting word and then sort of starts using that and it catches on because other people also agree that it's better. And then that becomes the word and the old word's just sort of a footnote.
I guess there's also the reality that words have multiple meanings, and you mentioned academia, so a word might mean one thing in, say, a biological sense, but then in a common parlance sort of sense, it means something completely different. For example, one thing that springs to mind is the word secular, which when talking about, say, society or politics, I guess essentially means like religion free from the legal and aspects of society and laws. But in, say, astronomy, it means change on a very
Long
long or
term.
long-term
Hmm.
timescale. And so those are quite different meanings that mean different things in different circles that aren't just kind of evolved. Well, I say evolved, but evolved in the like a cultural sense, not that the universe saw fit to
So the meaning has
arrive at.
evolved over a secular timescale.
Well, one example, like another good example, very common one is in Australia, what we call, chips, crisps, and so on. In the US, they call fries and chips, and that. Essentially, we have very, very different ways of naming tasty potato food, um, and those names cause confusions because we've decided to call deep fried rectangular potato as chips, whereas they call it French fries. And that's a name that we just, for some reason, I don't know how, I don't know the history of that, to be honest, I'm not a linguist, but that still persists to this day. And that's just how, you can say to anyone in Australia, they know what you're talking about. You go to another English-speaking country, and you'll have like 4 or 5 different confusions just on food made of potato. Because there's crisps as well, and there's, whatever. You know what I'm talking about.
Yeah.
Um,
When you read that
so,
first, oh yeah, go.
so you're right.
Oh no, I was gonna like pivot a little bit to my first thoughts when you read the first line from Hermogenes. But if you had other things to say, go say it.
No, get back on target. I think it's good.
Okay. Well, my first thought was, so when you read, I have often talked over this matter both with Cratylus, blah blah blah. It reminded me of this scene from a book I read. It's called I, Lucifer by Declan Gunn. There's a scene where you go into the Garden of Eden and there's Adam just wandering around and discovering all these new things. It's like, what is that? I think I might call it a butterfly. And what's that? I might call it dirt. Yeah, that seems to fit it. Dirt. And just reminded me of that, like how the names came to be. Because any word, the more often you say it, like if you just repeat it over and over, it starts to sound alien. That was just a weird thought that I had.
Well, it is a sort of belief that you would have had around this time, like that sort of scene is taken from like Genesis 2, where God takes all the animals, at least in front of Adam, and asks him to name them. We've got no idea what that is, and the language was changed long since then, but a lot of these cultures would have believed that there was some, and actually it comes up later in this book, we won't get to it, but like Socrates himself sort of states that some names are given by the gods, and therefore they are right. That there is a sort of original perfect name and language for these things. And that's sometimes it can be discovered, other times it's changed. Like probably one of like Socrates does make a lot of good observations about language here, even if his big points are pretty off. His general principles are pretty good. Like he recognizes, for one thing, that Greeks, like the Greek language at this time, was evolved from a barbarian language that had links to various other languages around it, that it had dialects. He recognized how some of these changes happened around vowels and other things. Um, so he sort of has this recognition that all this language comes from somewhere else, which is pretty cool. That turned into a tangent, and I've forgotten my original point. So let's just move on, because a lot of this stuff will come back. Right, Socrates' turn. I dare say that you may be right, Hermogenes. Let us see. Your meaning is that the name of each thing is only that which anybody agrees to call it. That is my notion, says Hermogenes. Whether the giver of the name be an individual or a city? Yes. Well now, let me take an instance. Suppose that I call a man a horse, or a horse a man. Do you mean to say that a man will be rightly called a horse by me individually, and rightly called a man by the rest of the world? And a horse again would be rightly called a man by me and a horse by the world? That is your meaning? He would, according to my view. But how about truth then? You would acknowledge that there is in words a true and a false? Certainly. And there are true and false prepositions? To be sure. And a true preposition says that which is, and a false proposition says that which is not. Yes, what other answer is possible? Then in a proposition there is a true and false, certainly. That's probably a good spot there. It's really hard to cut this up because it follows the Greek pattern of we just continuously build on this same point. But yeah, this carry on. I was just going to explain.
Oh no, you explain it because I was going to take a stab at something in the dark. Go for it.
Well, he's just sort of saying, it's Socrates just sort of rebuttal that, okay, you say this, but there is a wrong way to call things. If I point at an apple and say it's blue, then either I'm looking at a really weird apple or I'm wrong. According to sort of Hermogenes' way is, no, that's not really wrong. Or maybe it's partly wrong because no one else agrees on that term. This is, you do get this kind of funny thing with,
useful.
Yeah, you get a funny thing with philosophy where absolutes and absolute statements are basically everything. If it doesn't work for everything, it works for nothing, and all sorts of weird absolutisms that Greek philosophy fell into a lot of pits with, and probably modern too.
Sif deals in absolutes.
Isn't that an absolute?
Yes, it's that's from a Lego skit. Anyway,
Yeah, I know.
No, I do like where they're coming from with this. Although I guess to me it's like, how is this actually useful in the sense of, yeah, you're technically correct, but like when naming something, I mean, It's basically you've given a word or a string of characters if you're a program to an object or an action or some other entity that exists. Okay, an abstract concept even. The thing is that that name is only as useful at being a name if that can be communicated. So, like, if someone goes up and points at a four-legged big animal and calls it a man, and looks at a person calls that a horse, they're wrong, but you can actually understand that they swapped it. So you know what I'm saying? Like it's not as big a deal as I think these two guys are arguing. I don't know. Like, yeah. The fact that you can notice that change as opposed to being completely confused means that there's some information still being transferred.
So we get some interesting examples of this sort of thing too in, okay, at what point, I suppose this is tangential a bit again, but at what point do you switch from something being wrong to it being the right term? Like for the sort of
Saying people
our
would tell you on
generation
Tumblr about it.
example of Pluto used to be a planet. Now it is a microplanet, I think. Is that what they're
Dwarf
called?
planet.
Dwarf planet.
Dwarf planet. So it didn't change its name too much, but like, what is the correct one now? Like, it's academically it's dwarf planet, but if you just went by number of speakers, it's probably planet. Although that got pretty widespread, that bit of news. But
Yeah.
what was my other example? Oh, my other.
I mean, I guess that's a
No, I
bit
don't
of
want to
a.
get into the dating system. I was going to complain
I
about
guess
the
this is sorry.
BCE dating system, but
Oh.
that's just me wanting to complain about that stupid decision.
Well, just from my ignorance, is there actually a decision on that? Because I still use BC for everything.
It never got. Well, I suppose it's a decent example because it hasn't got that sort of critical mass to be accepted. You'll see it
Well,
in,
everyone knows what I'm
like,
talking
even in
about when I
scholarly
say BC.
articles, you will see some that use BCE and what even is the other one? It's
I
just
guess this is a
BC
very
and
good
BCE,
example.
isn't it?
A very
Yeah,
good
it's just
example because
before Common Era and before Common Era.
Ah, see, there we are. I knew they only differed by
yeah,
one letter.
it's just
Yeah.
CE and yeah.
And you'll see just as many that use BC and AD. And
Right.
because it wasn't, I guess it wasn't considered correct enough because you didn't change, there was no real reason to change it. It's like, okay, sure, AD means year of our Lord in Latin, but one, who speaks Latin anymore? We use Latin words for everything that we don't mean. Maybe it's offensive to people, but is it offensive to people to say Thursdays if they're worshipping Thor still? Like, so that argument was never very strong, and they also chose the dumbest names ever. Like, what is a common era before common era? Like, if you actually went with
Common Era is
Christian
still...
era, it's like it makes more sense.
Yeah.
But you've just used the same start point and changed the date, and then
Yeah.
they're just a really bad choice because they differ by one letter. It's terrible, especially if you're speaking it. Like if you just sort of zone out for a second and they're saying, "Oh, this is in 1000 CE." Like, did you miss the BCE? Like, at least the others used 4 different letters.
Is it the Islamic calendar where like we're in the year 5000, or is it that's a Jewish one?
I wouldn't be surprised
Anyway,
if they
like,
both used the same calendar because they both draw from the Old Testament.
no, but they like the three major Abrahamic religions have different years according to various points in time. But yeah, like Common Era is as arbitrarily picked as BC and AD, and I don't know. So yeah.
I mean, this is one of those cases where I guess there's a scholarly interpretation and a wider interpretation. Because I mean, these words only, or phrases only, like pick up meaning as more and more people begin to use them and accept them as the phrases. Then they reach critical mass, and then it's really hard to change the public consensus on it, I guess, as you mentioned with Pluto. Like in the academic scientific world, it's a dwarf planet because we were finding lots of other objects out there, and so scientists said, okay, let's categorize things. We're scientists. So they made a new category. But if you're talking to someone in the public and they say the ninth planet, you can probably take a guess at what they mean. I guess same as BC and BCE or AD. I guess they can be used interchangeably as different social groups that are separate from each other. The terms might diverge, even though these examples are not so much a forceful change, but a conscious decision to change terms rather than like a natural progression where words slowly change meaning over years or decades.
Yeah, it's hard to find good examples. Like, there's the examples I pulled out because they're like super contemporary. Like, there are some that are words that are kind of in a bit of language change at the moment, just sort of naturally.
Like terrific.
What?
Terrific.
What?
That used to be like this
Terrifying.
derived from terrifying, yeah.
Yeah.
And now
Awesome
it's like
is another
fantastic.
one.
Yeah,
Yeah.
awesome.
Because it's used so casually.
It's like be in awe of something, Yeah.
Like it's like that supernova was awesome, and I could be trivializing it or like genuinely awestruck at like the natural world. But one of them is, I guess, more common than the other these days.
And you got things like spirit, like you have ghost, which was sort of used to be the same as soul, what we would say soul is now. That became super, well, probably what happened is that became associated with like what we would think of as ghosts today, sort of out of body, ethereal humans or creatures or whatever. So then we went to spirit, and that's slowly fallen into the same trap. So now we have soul, and we just keep dredging up new words to sort of feel like as one word changes, we use another to sort of fill its place in that case. Like potentially this is something that will happen with awesome and stuff, like in the future. But it's hard to tell with those because they're kind of common. When words sort of become that sort of super casual, common parlance thing, it's kind of people don't tend to replace them as much because they don't need them in the formal context. You sort of get less. I'm just basing this off thinking at the moment, but it seems like that's less likely to change than when a word sort of is drifting from its actual meaning in, at very least, sort of a semi-formal natural speech. Like the sort of, I was going to say the sort of words you'd write down rather than just say to your friends, but oh my goodness, the internet and writing these days.
Another sort of example is it's a conscious change, but it's, I guess, a conscious change against pressure is reclaiming words. For example, words that might be used as slurs against a particular group, and that group opting to reclaim the word and use it to self-identify, to kind of strip it of its power. An example might be the word
ginger.
Like the movie Wog Boy.
Yeah, or like queer, the word, as it applies to like LGBT folk. Words that were slurs but have kind of been reclaimed to the community to the extent that the community might self-identify as them.
I think some words still, you can only use them if you're part of the community.
Oh, yeah, for sure.
No matter what your intention may be.
Yes, I would definitely agree with that.
Otherwise, you get stabbed by internet pitchforks on fire.
Only a ginger can call another ginger.
Tim Minchin, that guy.
young folk with your internet things.
He's older than all of us. By a fair way. Anyway.
Right, let's carry on. Awkward spot to resume from, kind of, but Socrates. But is a proposition true as a whole only, and are the parts untrue? No, the parts are true as well as the whole. Would you say the large parts and not the smaller ones, or every part? I should say that every part is true. Is a proposition resolvable into any part smaller than a name? No, that is the smallest. Socrates. Then the name is a part of the true proposition? Yes. Yes, and a true part, as you say, yes. And is not the part of a falsehood also a falsehood? Yes. Then if propositions may be true and false, names may be true and false. So we must infer. Alright, what do we think of this little deduction?
Oh.
It's very philosophical.
Yeah. Certainly is. I didn't think about this one.
Are you allowed
We-
to make an analogy like that in philosophy?
Well, given that the Greeks kind of invented it, especially Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle, then
Hey,
I'd
Socrates got
say
the
they
call of
would.
philosophy first.
I'm not actually sure who started it. These guys were sort of to the end of the classical Greek period, so they wouldn't have actually started all this. But anyway, off topic.
I don't know. It seems very. We were discussing before, like the black and white, all-encompassing, or not at all nature of certain philosophies, and I mean, this seems to be applying a very rigid, deductive or reductive framework to something as fluid and flexible as language.
Hmm.
Yeah, I don't
I
really
mean,
have.
right now the way that's written out, I can agree with the course of Socrates' logic, but I still feel like there's some logical flaws in there. But maybe that's my bias coming out because I don't think that everything has its right name.
No, I don't think there's, intrinsically right name. Particularly, like, do dogs know that the names are dog? Like, is that it really its right name? Is the Latin actual species name the rightest name? But even then, it's still given by a person. I don't think like there's some intrinsic hidden name like that's like an atomic mass is something that's a inherent value, but not and the name isn't. The name isn't like a universal constant that you can measure and find out what it is. You know what I mean? I don't think the name is an intrinsic thing if that's what he's trying to say.
And I
Like,
mean, here Socrates says, how about truth then? You would acknowledge that there is in words a true and a false. But of course, words don't have to be either explicitly true or explicitly false. But yes, I agree with what you said, Jacob, in that it's applying a consciousness or one particular conscious framework to nature. I mean, like the speed of light has a value, but the value that we give it depends upon the system of units that we're using, which is ultimately
absolutely.
arbitrary.
Yeah, which is pretty arbitrary.
So yeah, I think there's a bit of overextension happening here. Like, it's like, yeah, no, it's not really you can't just assume just because there's a rightness that can be applied to things that therefore there must be one right way. And also because like you said, I like your philosophy of light because then you have to bring up units, and the units have to be agreed on. So what one person may consider right and wrong may be different from someone else's. That's what they can argue over, unless they have some sort of common system of right and wrong, or common entity of right and wrong. For us as Christians, that's God. There's just some sort of agreement on the standard used.
Man, all you physics people. See, I'm just sitting here thinking, man, I wonder what people will think of this conversation in 2,000 years. Oh, they thought light was a constant value, fools. Like,
Well,
I
what do they
just
think it was?
and then they
So
speed
they can
off in
follow
their
those
spaceships
chariot-
to the next galaxy.
sorry, I'm just
But
more
yeah,
questioning your hubris that people will be listening to our conversation in 2,000
Yeah.
years, Jesse.
well, I didn't want to say that no one listens to it now, did I?
Not
Gotta
that
be
no one was
hopeful.
thinking that. Don't worry.
But yeah, so where do I want to start with this? Probably the first thing to note is that, like, this is in some ways a debate. The absolute surety that Socrates is using in his arguments here is probably not how sure he actually is, because later on he looks at his own theories and says, okay, words aren't perfect because their constructors aren't perfect, and also a couple other things such as what was the other thing I was thinking of? Well, basically he sort of tears down his own ideas a little bit in that it's not as if names are black and white, true or false. He's sort of arguing that this is a thing that could exist, that there is a perfect name for everything. Like it's essentially the idea of the forms applied to language. So I'll just go over forms for a bit. So that's the sort of Greek idea. Specifically, I think Plato was one of the biggest sort of developers of the theory of the forms. It's the source of the it's just called the cave analogy or something, isn't it? But
Oh yeah, with the shadows in the wall.
yeah. So the basic idea of the forms is that there is a perfect blueprint, a perfect representation, a form for everything that exists, for everything in the universe, everything in the world, um, everything that could exist, everything that does exist. And the things that do actually exist are a sort of projection of that, full of imperfections. So the cave analogy is, say, like you're sitting in a cave, you're looking at there's light coming in from the cave entrance behind you, and figures are walking across the front of the cave. You see their shadows on the wall, but because you've never seen any different, you think the shadows are those objects. And so that's sort of the idea of the forms. We see the objects around us, we see the way the world is, we look at a rock and say that's a rock, but we've never seen the perfect rock, the form of a rock. And at least my take on Socrates' whole argument here is that he's sort of arguing that this occurs with words as well as with objects. That everything has this perfect name, that all the other names given to it are a sort of representation of, they're a representation of this object. So sort of like, if you know a little bit about taxonomy, you'll know that it's sort of, there is a, I think units work like this too, actually. You physics people can talk about that in a minute. But with taxonomy, you have when you're describing a species, there is a type specimen. You have a specimen that was taken somewhere that you do all the formal description of. The features that they have become the default features for that organism, and anything that shares the majority of those features is that organism. From that type specimen, you work out a name to give it. You give it the two Latin well, you give it the like 12 Latin names to describe it to kingdom level and whatever have you. But you give it its two sort of main names, the family name and the species name, and that describes this thing, this form that you have in front of you, and everything else fits under that category. So the idea of the forms is kind of like that, but applied to everything. And yet maths works like that, doesn't it? Like there is a silver block or something somewhere that is a kilogram.
Oh yeah,
It's
in France, like the SI units, there's like the second is determined by the cesium atoms decay rate,
Used to
and
be.
Yes.
yes,
Used to
and
be.
used to be. That's what
Yeah,
I was taught in
now.
high school, so it could have
Yeah,
been changed.
it was. Only a couple of years ago. They changed it to the amount of time. This is hilarious. It's the amount of the distance that light takes to go 1 meter. No, time, sorry, it takes for light to go 1 meter. So
Oh
they
yeah, which
take
is
it back to
2.99 blah 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 blah.
2.999. Yeah, 2.997 something by 10 to the power of 8. Yeah.
Yeah.
Anyway.
Yeah, so the kilogram is the only unit, the SI unit, that doesn't currently have a definition based on our understanding of the laws of the universe. For example, they're trying to work on a way to do it in such a way that you might be able to say, oh, a kilogram is exactly how much a sphere of radius x silicon is,
Yeah.
for example. Um, but yes, I can see your point, relating it to like a prototype in the case of taxonomy.
Alright, let's go to the next bit. Did I go to... I've actually lost where we were. Never
We
mind.
were at the so we must infer.
Okay, so I am in the right spot. And the name of anything is that which anyone affirms to be the name. Yes. And there will be so many names of each thing as everybody says there are. And will they be true names at the time of uttering them? Yes, Socrates, I can conceive no correctness of names other than this. You give one name and I another, and in different cities and countries there are different names for the same things. Hellenes differ from barbarians in their use of names, and the several Hellenic tribes from one another. And would you say, Hermogenes, that the things differ as the names differ? And are they relative to individuals, as Protagoras tells us? For he says that man is the measure of all things, and that things are to me as they appear to me, and they are to you as they appear to you. Do you agree with him, or would you say that things have a permanent essence of their own? Alright, let's talk about our buddy Protagoras here. So I kind of love that. This is the fun thing of sort of looking at, especially ancient Greek philosophy, in that you see that nothing's changed in 2000 years. Here we have Socrates arguing for an absolute truth. Meanwhile, his bud Protagoras is saying that no, it's just relative to everyone. Everyone has their own, all things are relative. And I've seen other debates on is man something beyond the material, or is everything just the material? Like all these sort of cutting edge great debates we think of these days, yeah, people were having them 2,000 years ago too. Oh, and as a quick note on the word barbarian, it just means any non-Greek. It's not actually as... I mean, it's sort of negatives because the Greeks are the best,
Yeah, the
and
Greek weren't known for their modesty or humility, really. Let's be honest.
well, yeah, but hey, your people just adopted the word, but um, it's not as negative as we would use it now. Like it's negative, but it doesn't mean primitive backwards people, or not to the degree that we would use it these days. It did kind of mean primitive backwards people. But for example, the Persians, like a highly respected rival empire in some ways, were considered barbarians, even if their civilization and everything was highly respected.
I guess to your point though about the this discussion that's been going on for at least 2,000 years, um, whether there's an absolute reality or a relative reality, to use the word real multiple times. I guess it depends on which way you look at it, because if you say consider, I don't know, art, for instance, and judging whether a sculpture is beautiful or whether a movie is an emotionally moving experience, that's each person will have a different reaction to that. Whereas if you say, can I breathe on the moon? You can't really have a different answer to that. Because, if I put the person who answers differently on the moon, they'll find breathing just as difficult as a person who believes that it would be difficult.
All right, let's get on to this
Yeah,
next. Oh, go on.
I was gonna say, yeah, I agree. There's a lot of things which aren't really. There's some things which aren't really open for. I mean, I guess they are open for debate, but they're very easily, I guess, resolvable. There's, differences. Yeah, like, can you breathe in the moon? Moon? Yep. Try it. Nope. Okay. Done. Uh, yeah.
Right, so let's get on to this next bit, because this is this is kind of the interesting, like, little phrase that made me want to do this. Alright, so Hermogenes. There have been times, Socrates, when I have been driven in my perplexity to take refuge with Protagoras. Not that I agree with him at all. What? Have you ever been driven to admit there was no such thing as a bad man? No, indeed. But I have often had reason to think that there are very bad men, and a good many of them. Well, and have you ever found any very good ones? Not many. Still you have found them, yes. And would you hold that the very good were the very wise, and the very evil very foolish? Would that be your view? It would. But if Protagoras is right, and the truth is that things are as they appear, how can some of us be wise and some of us foolish? Impossible. If, on the other hand, wisdom and folly are really distinguishable, you will allow, I think, that the assertions of Protagoras can hardly be correct. For if what appears to each man is true to him, one man cannot in reality be wiser than another. He cannot. So it occurs to me that this might have lost a little in translation. I haven't been able to find a Greek manuscript of this that I could sort of look into. I might open a tab and do that in a minute. But
Because
yeah,
it
this
sounds like
is
there's a bit of extension.
I wouldn't be surprised if it just says good and bad though. Like, and that the
Yeah.
extension is in sort of general ideas in philosophy at the time. Because it's very clear here that wisdom and good and folly and evil are basically synonyms in what Socrates is saying. But yeah, this idea that he's using as absolute truth that there are bad men and good men, and it's not just how each man appears to himself, is a very interesting debate. One that I would not really
Well,
agree with at all.
there's a couple. I think there's a few things happening there, which is, I guess, one is a reference frame of the target, and one's a reference frame of the judge. Like, are you talking about? Because I think they're kind of trying to deal with, okay, who's decided right and wrong, and what has been decided was the target of that decision. You know what I mean? So who gets to say what is foolish or wise? You know what I mean? And what's the relation to what is being called foolish or wise? Because otherwise, too, we could look at each other and say, you're both fools. Each other, they're fools. And be technically correct within their own reference plane, or both say you're both wise, and go, yeah, of course you're wise. You said I was wise. And you know what I mean? It's I'm saying, like, it kind of, again, this is really absolute. There's a really absolutes they're kind of trying to overextend to, which makes it less realistic and very, I guess, rigid in their way of thinking.
I'm sure if you ask most people, they would say that they're a good person, or at least they try to be, even if, to a great many people, their actions are anything but. I can think here that humans are very great at being susceptible to any number of cognitive biases, and the nature of cognitive biases are that we're often not aware of them, so you can hold to mutually contradictory viewpoints, and your brain manages to compartmentalize things so that you can hold both views at once. So in some respects, you could be a good person whilst having aspects that are detrimental to, say, the community. But I guess there's arguments to be made about the definitions of each word, is I suppose what we're discussing here, whether they're somewhat absolute or relative to everyone. But if everything's relative to everyone, the discussion kind of becomes meaningless anyway.
He does sort of. I'll finish off in the first point first. Though, is that yeah, like unfortunately the world doesn't fit into neat black and white, good people, evil people, and you'll always know the difference. Sort of fairy tale stuff. Like it's pretty well agreed. Actually, it's less agreed than it should be at the moment. But that Hitler was a pretty evil dude. But there's also been Hitler wouldn't have thought he was an evil dude. He thought he was doing the best for his people and for the world, and there were plenty of people who agreed with him. Like there's just differences in view. There's not really a good and an evil. Um, I mean, there is sort of for some things, like sort of murder for fun and
I mean, well,
other things. Like people, there are things that even the people who do them will just recognize, yeah, this is wrong. Like this is against everything innate in us that we should be doing, even if they do it. But other things, there's just so much that's just different perspectives on it.
I don't. I actually wonder if even that some people, like, very few in terms of population would actually think that's okay. Anyway, I think what you're doing there though is, like I'm saying, you got to have some way of assessing or having a standard for that. Your either right and wrong, wise, foolish, whatever it is that you're trying to judge or, I guess, evaluate. So, for example, in terms of killings for fun is wrong, 99% of the population will agree. Whereas other things maybe it won't be as lopsided. But you know, I don't know if even some historical figures would exactly be object to that. Some of the Mongols would probably be okay. For example, there might be a bunch that serial killers that might be okay with that. So, and yes, I know some might be self-aware that it's wrong, but like I think we're talking about um, the I guess the philosophy behind it. You can't actually assume that everyone is going to see a certain view as wrong, unless you have some sort of standardized standard or methodology. You know what I mean?
And such a methodology changes over time as well.
Depending on what it's based on, yes, absolutely. And even then, how you relate to it. So, for example, the way as a whole people of various faiths have acted in response to their faith has changed over time, even if the source of a person or set of beliefs of their faith has not changed. So there's something there to probably be discussed.
I guess the thing is that everyone will have their own. This is just a distillation of what's said into a different set of words, but everyone will have their own, perhaps subtly different, perhaps greatly different notion of what right and what wrong is. To use the Hitler example, to some people, moral good is white people, whereas to other people, a moral good is, all people are equal regardless of how their genes manifest in melanin.
I'm close to finding out what those words are. Okay, I want to go... Actually, I just want to go straight below homogenies. Storheden. Echichat kafes. Okay, so evil men.
Yep, that's what we're up to.
Oh, I'm reading. That's true. You can't. I found a Greek manuscript and I'm looking up what it says, and yeah, it just says evil men. If that's the bit I think it is, though, then it's sort of evil versus honorable men, which is a little different. Okay, I want the next Socrates thing.
So on that one, if you're talking about honor and good evil, I mean, again, depends on your definition. So, but we've already covered that people vary on it. The way I kind of see it is, let's just take an example of Emperor Hirohito, of Japan, World War II. He'll be considered, I guess, honorable, even though in the eyes of the Allies, not the best bloke. Someone who's probably seen as is big about honor, but also an enemy of people in Australia, US, and so on and so forth. There's also people who are dishonorable who are seen as good, like the classic Robin Hood. He's dishonorable, but he's painted in a positive light in general. Again, it does. I'm just picking these examples out because they're well known, but there's plenty of examples of people who are considered good or bad by society and honorable, dishonorable.
And for that example, say Robin Hood, it depends on where you're sitting. If I'm a billionaire sitting in my gilded chair and
He's evil and dishonorable.
If I've just had the rest of my gilded chairs nicked and sold to feed the poor by Robin Hood, I'm feeling that he's a bit dishonorable and not that good of a bloke, to use your Australian slang. But if I'm the poor person that's able to eat because Robin Hood said, "Hey, you don't need 6 gilded chairs, mate. You've only got one. You've only got one rear." I feel differently about him.
Alright, so we'll move on now. I don't actually know the word that they're using for good in the Greek. It's not one I'm familiar with. I know a couple of words for equivalents to good, but I don't know that one. So, no extra insight there. But anyway. Tangent. His argument, it kind of levels out a bit at the end, I think, there, because he's not... When he talks about wise versus foolish, it's kind of... Okay, well, some people... So it's sort of like the basis of academic exams. there will be some people who get the right answers and there will be some who get the wrong. It's not as if everyone's whatever they write down is correct because it's correct to them. It's that there is something like you will have A students and you will have C students. Like that's kind of what his argument boils down to there.
That's what I'm saying. If there's a standard, then then that's kind of what you use as your measuring stick.
Well, I took a lot longer there looking up Greek than I thought I did. Where did I cut off this? So we'll try wrap it up. Oh, there's a lot left. Alright, so we have just sort of do an overview. But yeah, there's a bit of an interesting idea. One of these other guys has Euthydemus, that all things belong equally to all men at the same time and always. For neither on his view can there be some good and others bad, if virtue and vice are always equally to be attributed to all. Actually, that could just be awkward wording.
Because it sounds like he's saying a lot of nothing right there. Just saying. Like, what is this some sort of magic timeshare in human knowledge? We can rent out the definition of the library book, but everyone has access to it. I'm not sure what he's trying to say, to be honest.
Yeah, I kind of took it as a sort of weird, sort of like a pantheism type idea where
But you don't loan ideas.
There is good and there is
quantity.
bad, and it is manifest in all people the world over. They sort of share from this pool, but the actual absolute of good and bad never changes. But it could just be a really weird way of saying what we've been saying, in that there is good and bad in all people all the time, and that no one is good or bad, that they have virtue and vice in equal measure.
I guess that one depends, though. I don't think everyone agrees that everyone has good and bad in them. I don't think that's true. I think a lot of people agree that everyone has good or bad in them, but I don't think everyone agrees on that. So, you know what I mean? Like, because I was just speaking for everyone who's ever lived and is living on that topic of are people good or bad, or good and bad, or is that universal? You know what I'm saying? Like you can't assume. I don't think it's fair to assume that every single person in all of humanity has that one belief. So I'm not really sure that's a fair statement. Does that make sense, what I'm saying there?
Yeah, I think I got it. I think I was a little distracted trying to work out how to best go over the remaining bits. Because he sort of just goes into the next bit of, he starts getting a lot more into stuff we've sort of talked about names, how naming is a part of it. So, like that actions are done according to their proper nature, like we do the right action when we are cutting a board, we cut it to the correct it's really weirdly worded, but I think he's sort of saying that yes, there is a right way. Just as if we're trying to cut a plank for a house, we cut it in according to the blueprints in the right way. So he then applies this to speech, because this holds good to all actions. So if it applies to speech, then it applies to naming. And so there must be a right way of speaking, a right way of naming.
Oh man, hey, hang on. Like in those last three sentences, how many assumptions did he just make and jump through? I think we got a bit of a overextension here. Sorry, like, so there must be a right way to do something. So there must be a right way to name things. Like, that goes back to the intrinsic naming quantity, or where it's like something's atomic mass, or sorry, atomic number is probably much more accurate because that's a count rather than doesn't have units. So like, you know what I mean? Like that's intrinsic property. There's only one way you can make each element in terms of it's a count of bits. But it's just what do you call it? No, there's no one way to name it that's correct from a universal reference plane. You know what I mean? It's not like it's yeah. I don't think he followed logic there. Sorry. What do you guys think on that one?
Yes, he seems to be making the assumption that just because certain things follow rules, in that, you have an axe, it's objectively better at cutting a tree down than, I don't know, a bucket of water, means that somehow language obeys the same rules. Yes, it doesn't follow. As you say, he makes several assumptions, I feel.
I did cut a bunch of the argument out there. So his sort of, probably a more correct way of putting it is, like, an axe will cut a tree, a bucket will not. Because to cut, the cutting has to be done with a proper instrument and according to the natural process of cutting. You have to have that wedge of material harder than the material you're cutting to drive apart the atoms and so forth to cut. If you're doing it with a blunt edge or throwing liquid on it, that's not going to cut. Because his next example is burning. Like, you can't just burn anything, the burning has to be done right for it to work. And so he's sort
Right.
of arguing that
Okay.
names have
What
to
if?
be done right to work. And I think that's
But
more his argument
again,
as well, because he does continue on with saying that the tools, essentially that tools can be flawed, and so just as the tools, the people, the words which name something, they can also be flawed.
but this is the thing. Like when you break it down, you said, like it has to work. Again, how you define what it means for a name or whatever definition, whatever words to work. And what level of work is it mean to function at satisfactory level, or does it mean to be the one optimal solution? Because if he's talking about an axe being perfect for cutting a tree down, and I go, well, guess what? I'm 2,000 years in the future. I have chainsaws now. Like, um, is that really fair? You know what I'm saying? Like, it, there's a lot of, in one sentence, the logical flow is like, oh, if it works, that means it's fine. Or is he trying to say it has to work in the most optimal possible way that that could possibly exist based on a universal set of statements? Like, I don't know. I'm getting it, right?
Yes.
He's making some assumptions that unless he can discuss them or quantify exactly what he means, his statements don't actually have as much weight as he thinks he has.
Oh, he's got a whole book on this stuff. This is the this is the end of his introduction paragraph, basically, is what we're at now. And then he goes into several evidence points on, here is how these words have been constructed to be correct. Here's how the features were put together to make it correct.
Right, but you can build as much an elaborate framework as you want. But if your base assumptions, if you overextend literally 5 times in your first few sentences, well, not maybe the first few, but in the few sentences of like, okay, yeah, because you named the things this way, therefore there must be one way to do this, and therefore, yeah, there we go, everything's got its own perfect name. It's like even if you went to even went to explain that, like uh, it seems to be a loose logical fabric that ties it together, not a very rigid set of logical statements that link together strongly.
Because yeah, there are the degrees of. You don't just have something that, I think this is what you touched on. You don't have something that just works or it doesn't work. You can have degrees of working. So a blunt axe will work less well than a sharp axe. A bucket of water will work less well than, say, I don't know, a bucket of acid for cutting down cutting down a tree.
And
And
future
words
chainsaws, man, we're in the future.
Exactly. Uh, and words will have different utilities depending on what you're trying to describe. So if we're talking about a horse versus a man, as we were earlier, I could be using my words to describe the shape of the horse or the man, or I could be describing like the genetic structure of a horse versus a human. And depending on what the conversation is, those could have varying degrees of correctness. Like if I go to the Melbourne Cup and start talking about like the genetic structure of the lead horse, like describing the horse by just reading out the entirety of its like DNA, that's going to be a less effective way of describing the horse than just saying, I don't know, what's a Melbourne Cup horse? Blue Thunder. I don't think that's a Melbourne Cup horse, but I just made it up.
There was a horsey McHorse. Sorry.
Horsey McHorseface,
Yes.
really?
Yeah, we did discover today that there is a horse, or there was a horse, or it died recently, that was called Horsey McHorseface.
There's a
that's
ferry now called Ferry
That's-
McBoatface in
exactly.
Sydney.
Yeah, that's
Ferry McFerry
tangential.
face? Anyway,
Well, no,
and there's only
it's
one
a
true
name
name
that
for all
describes a
ferries now.
ferry.
Sorry.
And it's a name that
Yes,
most
it is the
people would
correct
consider
name.
terrible. Which again feeds into this sort of Socrates side of it, in that there are better names than other. Some names are better than others.
Well, if a name is just describes something, like if you say Ferry McFerryface, I immediately know that you mean the new ferry in the Sydney Harbour. Whereas
Pretty
if you use
descriptive.
something else, if you said, a medium-sized ferry with green flanges and red propellers,
Yeah,
that's
if like someone said
less
the Queen
specific.
Mary, they could be referring to Queen Mary or Queen Mary the cruise ship. That was a shitty analogy. Like this whole text sounds like Socrates is just making a whole bunch of very loose analogies which aren't really applicable. Like the whole
philosophy.
tool.
I mean,
Yeah.
I can grant for this text some leeway in that I guess it was very early on in philosophy, but like for me reading it today, it seems like one of the characters is literally an audience substitute, so that the other character can look smart throwing out his pet theories, while the other character just does nothing else but agree with him.
I mean, analogies work to a certain extent, but like it depends on the degree of separation between the two things that you're comparing. Yeah, the analogies that are applied here are far removed that it just doesn't make any logical sense to be discussed. So I was remembering this ad I saw, which was like a kid opens a fridge, like, what's for dinner? And it's just the fridge is full of bottles of water. And the analogy is like, you wouldn't give your plants just water because you should give them other things. And the analogy is between like plants and a human, which that analogy makes no sense because there's a lot of biological differences between the two species.
We
It was
all
a
know.
terrible ad.
We all know you have to give him Brawno. It's got electrolytes. It's what plants crave. Please don't give plants energy drinks. Please don't. Anyway, it's
Public service announcement: your children
to.
cannot
I had-
take in
sorry, I had
nutrients
to.
from the soil through their feet.
Yeah, so this was probably like a very important text for its time, but I feel like it's I feel like it's riddled with a lot of logical flaws.
I suppose I mean I agree it's got a lot wrong, and like I said, I analyzed the linguistics of this text and that was also wrong. But I mean it's par for the course for philosophy for one thing. Here is a truth. Use this truth to make new truths. But I think it's also worth noting that I've read the whole thing, whereas you guys have only had this part, so I know some of the later arguments and what he's actually getting at in some of this. But
Well, I
when I
hope
read
the
this,
later arguments aren't reflective of the quality of the earlier arguments.
when I read this, I think of like academic words, academic speech, jargon, in that there is in some ways a right and a wrong way to name things. Like we name cells, um, basically with function and site, like a leukocyte, white cell, a blastocyst. Um, I forgot what that one means. But
All I know is the mitochondria are the powerhouse of the cell.
yeah, like
Eh,
we make
But
scientific and specialist words by combining other words to describe the function, and those are good names for things. We could name um, like chloroplasts just something completely arbitrary. Like we could name them the Greek vases
greeny
of the
solar
cell.
panel thingies.
That doesn't even work because they kind of look like that. Like even I mean we see some of the truth Socrates is getting at here in that we both came up in trying to come up with random arbitrary names. We came up with names that describe it and fit with what it actually does.
But
So
that doesn't mean there's one right way. There's multiple right ways for your audience. If I'm showing primary school kids a mark set for the first time, I'm not going to go through the full scientific names of everything. I'm going to, hey, check out the big round thing that's purple, or like, maybe talk briefly about it, but, or, what I'm saying, or if you're trying, I think it's audience dependent, it's purpose dependent as well. I don't think there's one right way to name things still.
yeah, I'm not sure.
Exactly.
I'm not sure how much he is
'Cause,
going to. There is one way to name things. There is a like I
I
related it to
think,
the forms, but he doesn't go to that argument. That's just something I've related it in. It could just be
right.
that the argument just boils down to there are better ways to name things. And he
Well,
definitely does say
yeah.
later on that some names are better than others. Some were made more fitting.
Oh, I agree with that,
which
but that has got to
doesn't seem
be
to be
one of the,
saying much at all.
yeah, that's got to be one of the least impactful revelations ever. It's like, if I called everything Bob that exists in the world, it won't be helpful. Okay, yes, I don't think it. I think that statement, if it is there are better and worse things, ways of doing stuff, that's a very non-profound statement. That's like, yep, yep, we know. Thanks,
There
mate.
is a lot to that though, that
I guess if
like
you're going to quantifying how good or bad it is, like this is like an 8 out of 10 name, this is like a 7 out of 10 name, then there's actually some serious discussion there, I think, because then rating it and then judging how good a name is or isn't at describing something for the given audience, then there's some good discussion in that.
you engineers. But
Hey, go
like
put
it's
numbers in
easy to
something.
look at that statement and think, okay, that's obvious. Why would we bother with that? But it's a lot of things we consider obvious are because people like Socrates and Descartes and other philosophers and that have gone through at some point to sort of make this a part of our understanding of how we think. Like that there are better ways of naming things that are more descriptive to people, that give them a better idea of it, which helps them to understand it and to think of that um, better. Might not be a name that is immediately apparent to, like, might not be logic that is immediately apparent to some people. If you think
So
all
what you're
names are
saying is,
completely arbitrary, that languages have no logic in what they're named, like especially if you're doing this as a linguist, um, like if you're going out to some unknown culture group with its language, and you just assume that it's completely arbitrary what they've done, then that could be like that's an easy assumption to make, but that could also be a wrong assumption to make, just as um, like Socrates may be wrong in what he's saying here in the absoluteness with what he's saying, but he's also got a lot of elements of this is right, this is something we should think about more.
So I guess this is, I touched on it a little earlier in that we should be judging this passage by the merits of the time. Like, this may be a truth that is self-evident to us now because it's just at a low level in the culture and everyone just happens to know it, whereas at the time it was formalizing things in the same way that I guess if you ask most adults in society, they'll, be able to understand the importance of arbitrary example, wearing clothes outside, whereas, a child might take some more convincing because it's the at least the cultural societal importance of wearing clothing is lost on them.
Yeah, but screaming is like the most fun thing you do at the time, so just scream instead.
Yeah, so I'd agree with that sort of that because ultimately that's what a lot of philosophy is. It's what do we take for granted? How do we prove what we've taken for granted? And how do we sort of use that to shape? It's like thinking about how we think and how to shape how we think in a way that's good. And often it breaks down as you get closer to things, and it has to sort of be practical. Like it's very easily to do a lot of philosophy talking about nothing, achieving nothing. And like
Navel gazing, right? As we call it.
But to just throw the baby out with the bathwater is also the wrong approach to go as well.
So then, for Australian culture, if you walk into a pub and get called a muppet, a flog, and a drongo, what does that actually mean?
Well, apart from the fact that a drongo is actually a bird, I don't know what any of the other things actually mean. I'm not very up on my Australian language.
One of them's a Jim Henson set of like marionettes.
The reason I ask that, there's actually, like, in Australian culture, there's certain uses of various words which are complete slang, which Australians, at least some Australians, take great care, it seems, in using them at certain times for certain aspects of calling someone something. So it seems like even Australians agree there are better and worse ways of naming to certain people and things.
I mean, I guess we seem to be doing a lot here of going around and picking. The word edge case comes to mind, but they're not necessarily edge cases. But we're just picking examples that kind of disprove or make the whole premise seem a bit silly. But I mean, if we're isolating it to the premise that some words have more descriptive power than others for naming things, considering like the name of a cell or something in the body, like, I don't know.
We can just use dwarf planet. Like, that's a category chosen for a point. It doesn't have the fancy Latin that I use as an example for other things with the cells. But yeah, we have English words that do the same thing.
So I guess talk about dwarf planet. The layperson will understand that it might just mean small planet, but if you're an astronomer, you'll understand that definition comes with 3 criteria, which is why Pluto was classified as a dwarf planet.
There's like non-planar orbit, highly elliptical orbit, and then
you can have planets with highly elliptical orbit or highly inclined orbits. That doesn't make it not a planet.
Yeah, for clarity, it's the 3 criteria for Pluto, or for to be a planet, are that you have to orbit a star, which Pluto does,
or multiple stars.
Or multiple stars. trust Reggie, the binary person, to call me out on that. Then there's you have to be large enough to pull yourself by gravity into like a sphere, essentially, which Pluto has. And the third one, which is a little bit more jargony, is that you have to have, quote, cleared your orbit, which essentially means you need to be like the largest thing in your orbit, whereas there's lots of other things out by Pluto and it crosses the orbit of Neptune, so it's not really its own thing. But that's beside the point for this discussion.
How does that work
It's
with
just
binary
Yeah.
planets? Because that's the thing, isn't it? Two planets
Do you
in
mean
close
do you
orbit.
mean planets around binaries?
No, like two similar sized planets sort of things that orbit
Like
each other
moon and planet combos
in
are
a sort
close
of.
in
So,
size.
well,
Sorry.
Pluto and its largest moon Charon, they orbit each other, and the point that they orbit is in the space between them. It's not actually within any one of the bodies.
Yeah, the center of
Um,
mass of that system is outside of like the biggest body, which is not even that big.
But they're still treated as a single system as far as like the laws of gravity are concerned in them going around.
Yeah, yeah.
But anyway, the point is that you can have a more descriptive name. Well, like you can call Pluto a dwarf planet, or you can call it Pluto.
And friends.
Or ninth planet. Each of them tells you something different about it. Like the word Pluto is a specific handle for it, whereas ninth planet is a little ambiguous these days, and dwarf planet is a category that applies to lots of things. But depending on the use case, different words will be different, but I guess we can all agree that if you're intending to get across a certain meaning, your word choice is important, be it picking, even if it's just a matter of picking words that are understood by your target audience. But this is just, I guess, communication. I wouldn't say that there's it's hard to say that there's objectively a best word to use for Pluto, because it changes depending on the case and how you want to refer to it, because you could refer to it as a Kuiper belt object. But if you're just speaking to a member of the public, that's meaningless. So, in conclusion, you can you can pick better descriptive handles for words to mean things to your target audience than others, but that doesn't necessarily mean that there's any objective as far as like natural order of things goes, truth or ranking of them.
Works for me as a conclusion.
Hashtag philosophy.
And we shall end with this quote by Hermogenes, quite true. So, yeah. The actual conclusion.
Thanks.
Like, that was a good conclusion. We can leave that as the conclusion.
Yeah.
So,
I don't have anything more to add myself.
because we've gone around in circles for half an hour now. So,
Yes.
yeah, philosophy. If this is interesting, we might do more. We'll probably do more anyway, because it's interesting. I'm hoping to look at some Descartes next time, though I'm not entirely sure I actually have any of his works. I can probably find them. But he did a lot of important ideas for the modern era, so...
Could do Pascal's wager. That's very topical.
I have no idea what that is, but yeah, link me and we can do
Oh,
that.
you would love it. Yeah.
It's actually really, really topical too. I've got in mind. Like,
Yeah.
yeah.
Well, maybe next week or next fortnight we'll do Pascal's wager then. But in any case, let's sign off for this week. See you all later.
See ya.
Yeah.
Goodbye.